Upon entering the humble farmer's house, the millionaire was paralyzed when he saw a painting on the wall, the same one his beloved made before disappearing 20 years ago. Thomas Williams wasn't a man easily impressed, especially not after everything life had thrown at him. As he looked out at the sprawling land in front of him, his eyes swept over the vast fields of the Texas countryside with a disinterest that had become second nature. This was just another stop on his business trip, a chance to check out a few farms he had plans to purchase, adding to his already massive portfolio. His heart wasn't in it, though. It hadn't been for a long time. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land, and the warmth of the late afternoon was the only thing that gave him any sense of comfort. But even that was fleeting. There was a heaviness to his chest that no amount of sun or success could lighten. The memories of his past, of Claire, still haunted him. It had been 20 years, yet the wound of her disappearance felt as fresh as ever. As his driver pulled up to the next farm, Thomas waved him off. "I'll walk for a bit," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The driver nodded and stayed behind, respecting his boss's desire for solitude. Thomas wasn't sure what drew him down the dirt path, away from the formalities of his business meetings. Maybe it was the emptiness inside him, the constant ache for something real, something that felt less transactional. The sound of his footsteps on the dry earth was the only noise that filled the quiet. And for a moment, he allowed himself to get lost in it. Up ahead, he spotted a small, humble house nestled among the fields, far removed from the mansions and luxury he was accustomed to. It stood in stark contrast to everything about his world, but there was something inviting about it. Without much thought, his feet carried him closer. As he approached the front yard, he saw a young woman, no more than 20 years old, working outside. She was pulling weeds from a small garden, her movements rhythmic and calm. Her long brown hair was tied up loosely, and her face glowed in the fading sunlight. She didn't seem to notice him at first, completely focused on her work, but when she finally did look up, her expression was warm, and she smiled like they'd known each other for years. "Afternoon," she called out, wiping her hands on her worn jeans. "Can I help you with something?" Thomas wasn't used to this. People rarely spoke to him so casually, with such openness. There was always a layer of formality, of expectation, whenever someone addressed him. But here, standing in the middle of nowhere, this young woman greeted him like an old friend. "I was just passing by," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Thought I'd take a look around." "Well, you're welcome to," she said, her southern drawl adding warmth to her words. "I'm Emily, by the way. This here's our family farm. Not much, but we make do." Emily. The name rolled around in his mind for a second, though it wasn't the name that caught his attention. It was the feeling, that strange pull toward her, something he couldn't quite explain. He glanced around the property, taking in the simple beauty of it. It was nothing like the polished landscapes he was used to, but there was a charm to its rough edges, a kind of honesty that was hard to find in his world. "Would you like some coffee?" Emily asked, interrupting his thoughts. "My mama makes the best brew you'll ever taste, I swear." Thomas almost declined, out of habit more than anything. He wasn't one for casual invitations or spending time in random strangers' homes. But something about this place and this girl made him say yes. "Sure, I could use a cup." Emily smiled again and motioned for him to follow her inside. The house was small, but cozy, filled with worn furniture that looked like it had been passed down through generations. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air, and Thomas found himself relaxing despite himself. As they stepped into the living room, something caught his eye, and his heart stopped. There, hanging on the wall, was a painting. It was a simple depiction of a field, the sky a perfect blend of soft blues and oranges, with wildflowers scattered across the foreground. But it wasn't just any field. It was the exact same scene Claire had painted for him all those years ago, back when they were inseparable, back when he thought they had a future together. He stared at the painting, his breath shallow, the world around him blurring. How was this possible? This painting, this exact scene, was something only Claire could have created. It had been hers, a part of their life together, a piece of the past he thought was lost forever. Who painted this? His voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. Emily glanced at the painting and smiled. Oh, that. My mom did. She's real talented with a brush, though she doesn't do it as much anymore. Too busy running the farm and all. She's in Austin right now, picking up supplies. Should be back by tomorrow, though. Thomas's mind raced. His pulse pounded in his ears. Could it be? Could it really be Claire? After all these years, after all the pain and heartache, was she still out there? Alive? Thomas couldn't take his eyes off the painting. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what Emily had just said. The scene was too familiar, too specific to be a coincidence. He had stood in that exact field with Claire, watching her paint it while the sun set behind them, casting the same warm glow as in the picture. But how could it be here, in this small farmhouse, in the middle of nowhere? He swallowed hard, trying to control the surge of emotions rising in his chest. Memories he had buried for so long were flooding back, overwhelming him. He turned toward Emily, his voice strained as he asked, "Your mother, what's her name?" "Claire," Emily replied with a casual shrug. "Claire Thompson." Thomas felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. It couldn't be. Claire Thompson? Could she really be the same Claire Johnson he had loved? The same woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace 2 decades ago? His hands clenched into fists at his sides, not out of anger, but from the sheer intensity of the moment. Every fiber of his being wanted to believe it was her, but doubt gnawed at him. He couldn't ask directly, not yet. He needed more information. "How long have you lived here?" he asked, trying to keep his tone even, though his mind was swirling with 1,000 questions. "Pretty much my whole life," Emily said with a small laugh. "My mama moved out here when I was just a baby. She's always liked the quiet, the wide-open spaces, said it was the perfect place to raise a kid." Thomas nodded, though he could barely focus. The Claire he knew had lived in the city, far from any farm. But then again, she had disappeared, leaving behind everything she had once known. If she had suffered memory loss or trauma, maybe she had rebuilt her life in a place like this, far from the chaos and pain of her old life. She never talks about where she's from, though, Emily added, her brow furrowing a little. "I've asked a couple of times, but she always just says, 'It's in the past, Emily. It doesn't matter anymore.' So I stopped asking." Thomas's heart ached at the thought. What had Claire gone through all these years? What had happened to her after she disappeared? He had searched for her, tirelessly at first, but eventually, as the years dragged on with no answers, he had been forced to accept that she was gone. Dead, perhaps. He had tried to move on, but the pain of losing her had never left him. And now, here he was, standing in a house with her daughter, for God's sake, and staring at a painting that was a ghost from his past. "Is your mom still in Austin?" he asked, his voice a little steadier now, though the anticipation was killing him. "Yeah, she'll be back tomorrow morning, I think," Emily replied, offering him a small, friendly smile. "You're welcome to come by then. She'll be real surprised to meet someone new. We don't get many visitors out this way." Thomas forced a tight smile, nodding. "I might just do that." They chatted for a few more minutes, but Thomas's mind was elsewhere. He kept glancing at the painting, his thoughts spinning out of control. Could it really be Claire? And if it was, how would she react when she saw him? Would she remember him? Or had the years and whatever had happened to her completely erased their life together? After finishing his coffee, Thomas thanked Emily for her hospitality and made his way back outside. The warm Texas air hit him like a wave, but it did little to clear his head. He walked back toward the road, where his driver was waiting, and climbed into the car in a daze. "Back to the hotel, sir?" the driver asked. Thomas nodded absently, staring out the window as they drove away. His mind was consumed by a single thought. Tomorrow, he would see Claire again. Tomorrow, he might get the answers he had been searching for all these years. But there was a weight in his chest, a fear that gnawed at him. What if she didn't remember him at all? What if she had moved on, built a new life, a new family, and he was nothing more than a ghost from a past she had no desire to revisit? The drive back to the hotel felt like a blur. When he finally reached his room, Thomas collapsed into the armchair by the window, staring blankly at the horizon. His mind replayed every memory he had of Claire, their first meeting, their long walks together, the way she laughed when he told her stories, the warmth of her hand in his. And then, the day she disappeared. The day his life had changed forever. He hadn't been the same since. Sure, he had found success in his career, built an empire, and lived a life most people would envy. But none of it had filled the void she had left behind. None of it had brought him the peace he so desperately craved. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas made a silent vow to himself. No matter what happened tomorrow, he would get to the bottom of this. He had to know if Claire was the same woman he had lost all those years ago. And if she was, he had to find a way to make things right. The next morning came slowly for Thomas. He had spent most of the night tossing and turning, his mind unable to shut off. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Claire's face, the way she had looked at him all those years ago, full of life and love, and the way she had looked in that old photograph he'd held onto for 2 decades. The photograph he now planned to show her. By the time the sun finally rose, casting pale light through the hotel curtains, he had made up his mind. Today, he would face the truth, whatever that might be. Whether Claire remembered him or not, he needed answers. He had waited long enough. Thomas got dressed in a rush, his hands trembling slightly as he buttoned his shirt. He didn't even bother with breakfast. Too anxious to think about food. He needed to get back to Emily's house. He needed to see Claire. As the driver pulled up in front of the small farmhouse once again, Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest. The house looked the same as it had the day before, small, unassuming, peaceful. But the weight of what was about to happen made everything seem more significant, more intense. Emily was outside again, tending to the garden, just as she had been when he first arrived. She glanced up when she saw him, her face lighting up with a smile. "Morning, Mr. Williams," she called out. "You're back early. I take it you're here to meet my mom." Thomas nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't trust his voice right now. Emily wiped her hands on her jeans and motioned toward the house. "She's inside," Emily said, her voice filled with the easy warmth that seemed to define her. "Come on in. I'll grab her for you." Thomas followed her inside, his heart racing faster with each step. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. He stood in the small living room again, staring at the painting on the wall, the one that had set everything in motion. He didn't even hear Claire enter the room at first. "Emily says we have a guest," came a soft voice from behind him. Thomas froze, his breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't move. Slowly, he turned around, and there she was. Claire Thompson, or Claire Johnson, as he had known her. She looked so different from the woman he remembered, yet there was something unmistakably familiar about her. Her hair, now streaked with gray, was pulled back loosely, and there were lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. But it was her. It was Claire. She looked at him, her expression polite but curious, as if she were meeting a stranger. And in many ways, she was. The last time they had seen each other, they had been young, in love, full of dreams for a future that had never come to pass. Now, they were both older, both carrying the weight of years lost. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas's chest tightened painfully as he searched her face for any sign of recognition, any flicker of the past they had shared. But there was nothing. Her eyes were warm but distant, as if she were looking through him, not at him. "Oh, Thomas," he said, his voice hoarse. "My name is Thomas." She smiled politely and nodded. "It's nice to meet you, Thomas." He swallowed hard, the pain of that simple sentence hitting him like a punch to the gut. She didn't remember him. How could she not remember him? Desperation clawed at him. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph he had carried with him for all these years, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded it. It was an old photo, worn and faded from being handled so many times, but it was clear enough. It showed the two of them, Thomas and Claire, standing side by side, smiling, young and in love. "Do you remember this?" he asked, his voice low, almost pleading. Claire looked at the photo, her brow furrowing slightly. She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied it. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw something, a flicker of recognition, a shift in her expression. But then she shook her head slowly, her face clouded with confusion. I don't know," she said softly. "I'm sorry, but I don't remember." Thomas's heart sank. He had prepared himself for this, but hearing it out loud was something else entirely. She didn't remember. The woman he had loved more than anything, the woman he had spent 2 decades searching for, had no memory of him, of their time together, of the life they had planned to build. "I used to know you," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were going to be married. You painted that picture on the wall right there. You used to live in the city. Your name wasn't always Thompson. It was Claire Johnson." Claire's eyes widened slightly at that, and she took a step back, her hand going to her mouth as if she were trying to steady herself. "Johnson," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know." Her confusion seemed genuine, and it broke Thomas's heart all over again. She wasn't pretending. She truly didn't remember. Something had happened to her, something that had erased her memories of him, of their life together. "Please," he said softly, taking a step closer to her. "Just think, try to remember. We loved each other. We were going to start a life together, but you disappeared. I never stopped looking for you." Claire shook her head slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know," she whispered again. "I don't know what you're talking about." Emily, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward, her brow furrowed in concern. "Mom, are you okay?" Claire nodded quickly, wiping at her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. I need a minute." She turned and hurried out of the room, leaving Thomas standing there, feeling like the ground had fallen out from beneath him. Thomas stood frozen in the middle of the living room, watching as Claire disappeared down the hallway. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of hope and despair churning inside him. She didn't remember him, at least not fully, but something had stirred within her. He had seen it in her eyes, a glimmer of recognition, a faint flicker of something long buried. Emily stepped forward, breaking the silence. Her face was etched with concern as she looked toward the hallway where her mother had just gone. "I've never seen her like that before," she murmured, almost to herself. "She's always been so calm." Thomas could barely find the words to respond. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than he had expected. He had come here looking for closure, for answers. But now that he was face to face with Claire, it was more complicated than he had imagined. The years of wondering, the endless search. It had all led to this. But the resolution wasn't as clear as he had hoped. "I'm sorry," Emily said, shaking her head. "I didn't know. I didn't know there was all this history. You really knew her. Before." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "We were in love. We were going to be married, but then she disappeared. And I never knew what happened. Until now." Emily's eyes softened. "I had no idea. She never talked about her past. At least not anything before I was born. I just thought she'd lived out here her whole life, working on the farm." But now... She glanced down the hallway again, uncertainty clouding her expression. I guess there's more to the story than I realized. Thomas could feel the gravity of the situation settling over them both. He had always wondered about Claire's past after she disappeared, but he had never imagined that she had built a whole new life, raised a daughter, and never looked back, never remembered. The ache in his chest deepened as he thought about all the years lost, all the moments they could have shared. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and Claire reappeared. Her face was pale, her eyes still wide with confusion, but there was a determination in her step as she approached them. She didn't look at Thomas at first, her gaze fixed on Emily as if seeking some kind of reassurance. "Mom?" Emily said gently, stepping toward her. "Are you okay?" Claire nodded slowly, though the uncertainty in her eyes hadn't faded. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice shaky. "I feel like... I don't know. Something's wrong. Something's missing." She finally turned to look at Thomas, and he could see the struggle in her expression, the way she was trying to piece things together but coming up short. He took a step closer, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "Claire, I know this is confusing, but you need to understand. What I'm saying is true. We were in love. We had a life together, and then you disappeared, and I've spent the last 20 years trying to find you." Claire closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to block out the overwhelming rush of information. When she opened them again, there was a flicker of something, a memory perhaps beginning to surface. I remember being scared," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's all so blurry, like pieces of a puzzle I can't put together." Thomas felt a surge of hope. She was starting to remember. "You were taken from me," he said softly. "Something happened, and you were gone. But I never stopped looking for you." Claire wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. "I don't remember that," she whispered, shaking her head. I remember a field. There was sunlight, and I was painting. But everything else is just... gone." Thomas's breath caught. The field, the painting. She was remembering something real, something from their life together. "That's where it started," he said gently. "You were painting a field, the same one in that picture on the wall." He gestured to the painting, and Claire's eyes followed his gaze, lingering on the image she had created so long ago. "I painted that?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. You did," Thomas confirmed, stepping closer to her. "You painted it before everything changed, before you were taken from me." Claire's hand went to her mouth again, her fingers trembling. I don't know what to believe. It feels so real, but at the same time, it's like I'm looking at someone else's life. Someone I don't even know." Thomas's heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine how disorienting it must be to have pieces of her past return in such a fragmented way. But he couldn't give up. Not now. "It's your life, Claire," he said, his voice firm but filled with compassion. "I know it's hard to remember, but everything I'm telling you is true. You were taken, and something happened that made you forget. But we can figure this out together." Claire's eyes welled with tears, and she took a step back, shaking her head. I can't do this right now." Her voice broke, and she turned toward Emily, her hands shaking. "I need some air." Emily moved toward her mother, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It's okay, Mom," she said soothingly. "Let's go outside. You can take a break." Thomas stood back, watching helplessly as Emily led Claire out the front door. The sound of the screen door slamming shut echoed through the quiet house, and suddenly Thomas felt like he was suffocating in the silence. He hadn't expected this. He had hoped that seeing him, hearing his voice, would be enough to trigger Claire's memories, to bring her back to him fully, but the reality was much messier, much more painful. He moved to the window, watching as Claire stood on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face turned toward the sun. Emily was next to her, speaking softly, but Thomas couldn't hear the words. All he could feel was the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to do next. Thomas remained by the window for what felt like hours, though it had only been a few minutes. His mind was clouded with thoughts, memories, and uncertainties. Claire was just outside, struggling to piece together fragments of a life she no longer remembered. Every instinct in him screamed to run out there and help her remember, to pull her into his arms and tell her everything would be all right. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. As he stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his reverie. He glanced at the screen, his heart sinking when he saw the name. Victoria. Of course she was calling now. It had been a while since they'd spoken, long enough for her to wonder what he'd been up to. For years, their relationship had been distant, civil at best. The warmth of sibling love had long since been replaced by cold formality. After all, Thomas had never been able to forgive Victoria for the way she had undermined him, sabotaging relationships and business ventures alike. But this was different. Now, he suspected there was something far more sinister lurking beneath her surface. Taking a deep breath, he answered the call. Victoria. Thomas, I've been trying to reach you for days, Victoria said sharply, her tone clipped. What are you up to in Texas? I got word you're looking at buying some land there. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the familiar surge of irritation that came whenever Victoria tried to involve herself in his affairs. It's business, Victoria. You don't need to concern yourself. You've never liked to keep me in the loop, have you? She snapped. And then there was a pause, a shift in her tone. Is it business, though, or something else? I heard you've been visiting people. His pulse quickened. There was something about the way she said it that set him on edge, like she knew more than she was letting on. What are you getting at? I don't know. What am I getting at? She asked, her voice dripping with false innocence. You're always so secretive, Thomas. One would think you're hiding something. But maybe, just maybe, it's you who's digging around where you shouldn't. He clenched his jaw, trying to control the rising anger. There was no way Victoria knew about Claire. She couldn't. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that everything about Claire's disappearance, everything about the strange circumstances surrounding her reappearance, seemed to point back to his sister. The pieces began to fall into place, each revelation hitting him like a blow. The distance between them, the jealousy Victoria had always harbored, the way she had undermined him and sabotaged every relationship he had tried to build, including his one with Claire. He had thought it was all just petty rivalry, nothing more. But now, as he stood there, listening to the smugness in her voice, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Victoria had done something terrible. And it had everything to do with Claire's disappearance. Victoria, he said, his voice low and steady, though the anger beneath it was palpable. What did you do? There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough for Thomas to hear the faintest intake of breath, the slightest hesitation. I don't know what you mean, she replied, her tone tight, but she did. He could hear it in her voice, in the way she avoided his question. I'm not playing games with you anymore, he said, stepping away from the window, his voice rising. I found Claire. Did you hear that? I found her. Another pause. This one longer. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Claire Johnson, the woman I was going to marry before she disappeared 20 years ago. The woman you couldn't stand. The woman I'm starting to believe you had something to do with when she vanished. For the first time in the conversation, Victoria's composure cracked. He could hear her breath quicken, hear the barely contained shock in her voice. You don't know what you're talking about, she snapped. "I know more than you think," Thomas shot back, "and I'll find out everything. So you better start talking now before I dig deeper." There was a long, tense silence, and then, finally, Victoria's voice came back, cold and calculating. "You always were too soft when it came to her," she said quietly, "too blind to see that she wasn't good for you." Thomas's chest tightened, a wave of anger surging through him. "What did you do, Victoria?" "She was going to ruin everything," Victoria snapped, her voice suddenly full of venom. "She was pulling you away from the family, from your responsibilities. You were supposed to be focused on the business, on your future. But all you cared about was her. You couldn't see how much she was holding you back." Thomas's mind spun. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So you, what, made her disappear?" "I didn't make her disappear," Victoria said, her voice cold again. "But I may have facilitated a situation where she wouldn't be a problem anymore." Thomas felt his stomach turn. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means she's gone, Thomas. She's been gone for 20 years. You've moved on, haven't you? You've built an empire. Why dredge up the past now?" He gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles white with anger. "Because the past is standing right in front of me, Victoria. She's alive. Claire is alive." Victoria's sharp intake of breath confirmed his worst fears. She hadn't known that Claire was still alive. Whatever plan she had put in motion 2 decades ago had failed, and now it was all unraveling. "You're lying," she hissed. "I'm not," Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. "I'm standing in the same room where she just told me she doesn't remember me, thanks to whatever you did." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Thomas could feel Victoria's fear. She had always been so in control, so sure of herself. But now, she was caught. "I'm going to find out everything, Victoria," he continued, "and when I do, you'll have to answer for it." Before she could respond, Thomas ended the call. His hands shook with anger as he dropped the phone on the table. He had finally uncovered the truth. Victoria had been behind Claire's disappearance all along. But now, there was something far more important to focus on. He had to find a way to help Claire remember, and he had to protect her from whatever might come next. The phone call with Victoria left Thomas reeling. His hands still trembled as he set the phone down on the table, but his mind was clearer now than it had been in years. The fog that had shrouded the mystery of Claire's disappearance was finally starting to lift, and though the truth was far uglier than he had imagined, at least he had something concrete to hold on to. Victoria, his own sister. She had orchestrated Claire's disappearance, manipulating the circumstances to tear them apart. All those years of heartache, the relentless search, and the unanswered questions, it all led back to her. But now, he had a new problem. Claire didn't remember any of it. And after everything she had been through, could he really put her through the pain of reliving it? He had to. She deserved to know what had happened to her, and she needed to understand why her life had been stolen from her. Thomas took a deep breath and made his way toward the door. Outside, Claire and Emily were sitting on the porch, the soft murmur of their voices drifting through the warm Texas air. Emily glanced up when she saw him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Claire, on the other hand, looked distant, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as though she were trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Thomas stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under his weight. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. "I need to talk to you, Claire," Thomas said gently, his voice steady but soft. "About everything?" Emily looked between them, her brow furrowed with concern. "Should I leave you two alone?" Thomas shook his head. "You're a part of this too, Emily. I think you both need to hear the truth." Claire turned her head slowly, her expression guarded. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept her emotions locked away, even when they were together. But now there was something more fragile about her, something that made Thomas's heart ache. She had been through so much, and she didn't even know the half of it. "Go ahead," Claire said quietly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil he knew she must be feeling. "Tell us the truth." Thomas pulled up a chair and sat down across from them, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times, but now that it was here, the words felt like stones in his mouth. "I've just spoken to Victoria," he began, his voice low, "and she's confirmed something I've long suspected. She was responsible for what happened to you." Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "Victoria, what are you talking about?" Thomas clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. "She was jealous. Of us. Of you. She thought you were a distraction. That you were pulling me away from the family, from the business. So she arranged for you to be taken, to disappear from my life." Claire's face went pale, her lips parting slightly as if to protest. But no words came. She looked at Emily, then back at Thomas, her breath shallow. That doesn't make sense. Why would she?" "I didn't know either," Thomas said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never understood why she hated you so much, but she's always been manipulative, always found ways to get what she wanted, no matter who she hurt." Emily, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up. "So, you're saying your sister, what, kidnapped my mom? How? How did this even happen?" Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't have all the details yet. But Victoria admitted to orchestrating the situation. Claire didn't just leave me, she was taken. And whatever happened after that, whatever trauma she endured, caused her to lose her memory." Claire shook her head slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. "This can't be real. I can't. I don't remember any of this." "I know," Thomas said gently. "I know you don't. But it's the truth, Claire. You were taken from me, and I never stopped looking for you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire stared down at her hands, her face a mask of shock and confusion. Emily sat beside her, eyes wide, trying to process everything that had just been revealed. "But how?" Claire finally whispered, her voice breaking. "How could this have happened? And I don't remember." "I don't know exactly," Thomas replied, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "But I think it had something to do with the accident. You said you remember being in a field, painting, but then everything after that is a blur, right?" Claire nodded slowly, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall the fragments of memory that had resurfaced. "I remember the field. I remember being scared. But everything else is just gone." Thomas swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "That's when you disappeared. I think something happened after that. Maybe you were running. Maybe you were trying to escape, and you got into an accident. That's when you lost your memory. And then, somehow, you ended up here, in this small town, building a new life." Claire's hands went to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. She looked at Emily, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say." Emily leaned forward, taking her mother's hand. "Mom, you don't have to say anything right now. This is a lot to take in. We'll figure it out. Together." Thomas watched as Claire's face crumpled, the shock and confusion giving way to raw, unfiltered emotion. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Emily wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly as she cried. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the sting of tears in his own eyes. He had spent 2 decades searching for answers, hoping for closure. But now that the truth was out, it didn't feel like the victory he had imagined. Instead, It felt like opening an old wound that had never properly healed. "I'm so sorry, Claire," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "I should have found you sooner. I should have done more." Claire didn't respond, her sobs quieting as she leaned into Emily's embrace. Thomas sat back in his chair, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a boulder. He had uncovered the secrets that had torn them apart, but now he wasn't sure if they could ever truly put the pieces back together. Hours had passed since the truth about Victoria had come out, but it felt like the weight of it still hung heavy in the air. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the porch where Thomas sat, staring into the distance. He had been here for a long time, giving Claire and Emily the space they needed to process everything he had told them. He didn't want to push, didn't want to force anything, but the silence was becoming unbearable. Inside the house, Claire was quiet. She hadn't said much after her initial breakdown. She had retreated into herself, trying to piece together the fragments of her memory, searching for something, anything, that would make sense of the mess her life had become. Emily had stayed by her side, offering comfort where she could, but there was only so much that could be said. The truth was painful, and Claire would have to face it in her own time. As the evening air began to cool, Thomas finally stood and walked back into the house. He found Emily sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She looked up when she saw him, offering a small, sad smile. "How's she doing?" Thomas asked quietly, glancing toward the hallway where Claire had disappeared earlier. Emily sighed, setting the cup down. "She's processing. I don't know. I think it's just a lot to take in." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "I know. I didn't want to drop everything on her like that, but she deserves to know what happened." "You did the right thing," Emily said softly. She needed to hear it. "We both did." There was a moment of silence between them, both of them lost in their thoughts. Emily had grown up in a world completely removed from the one Thomas had known with Claire. And yet here she was, pulled into the tangled web of their past. She had a right to be angry, confused, or even resentful, but instead she seemed calm, understanding in a way that surprised him. "Do you think she'll ever remember?" Emily asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Thomas exhaled slowly, leaning against the counter. "I don't know. I hope so. But even if she doesn't, it's enough that she's here, that she's alive." Emily looked down at her hands, nodding. "I just wish there was something I could do to help her. Just being here for her is enough," Thomas said gently. "You're what's kept her going all these years, Emily. You gave her a reason to keep moving forward, even if she didn't know what had happened before." Before Emily could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Thomas turned to see Claire standing in the doorway, her face pale but composed. There were dark circles under her eyes and her shoulders were tense, but there was a calmness in her that hadn't been there earlier. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly, her eyes meeting Thomas's. "Of course," he said, his heart racing as he stepped toward her. Claire motioned toward the living room, and the two of them walked in silence until they were standing in front of the old painting, the one she had done all those years ago, before everything had changed. "I don't remember everything," Claire began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I do remember some things. The field, the painting, you." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "You remember me?" "Not everything," she said, shaking her head slowly. "It's like flashes, pieces of a puzzle that don't quite fit together. But when I saw that photograph earlier, and when you told me what happened, it stirred something in me. I don't know if I'll ever remember it all, but I know there's truth in what you're saying. I know. I loved you." Thomas swallowed hard, the rush of emotion almost too much to bear. He had dreamed of hearing those words for so long, but now that they were finally here, it felt bittersweet. They had been through so much, and the years between them felt like an insurmountable distance. But still, the love remained, even if only in fragments. "I never stopped looking for you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were gone. I thought I had lost you forever. But now that you're here, Claire, I just want to make things right. I don't care if you never remember everything. We can start over. We can build something new, together." Claire's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "It's not that simple, Thomas. So much has changed. I've changed. I'm not the same person I was back then." "I don't care," Thomas said, stepping closer to her. "We've both changed, but we can still make this work. We have a second chance." Claire looked down, her hands trembling. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of what I don't remember. I'm scared of what Victoria did. I don't even know who I am anymore." Thomas reached out, gently taking her hands in his. "You're still the same person I fell in love with, and whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone." Claire closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future hanging between them. Finally, she nodded, her voice shaky but resolved. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll try." Thomas exhaled, relief flooding through him. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough. It was the beginning of something new, something they could rebuild together. Emily appeared in the doorway, her eyes filled with hope as she watched her mother and Thomas standing there, holding on to each other like two survivors of a storm. She had been a part of this journey too, and now, it seemed, they were all ready to take the next step. Claire pulled away slightly, wiping at her tears. "There's one thing I need to do before we can move forward." Thomas frowned, his heart sinking slightly. "What's that?" Claire's expression hardened, a fire returning to her eyes. "I need to confront Victoria. I need answers." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach at Claire's words. Confronting Victoria wasn't going to be easy, not after everything he had just uncovered. He wasn't sure what Victoria was capable of, but one thing was certain: Claire needed closure. She needed to face the woman who had ripped their lives apart and understand why. "Oh, are you sure that's what you want?" Thomas asked, his voice low, steadying himself for the possibility of more conflict ahead. Claire nodded firmly, wiping away the last traces of her tears. Her eyes, though red and tired, held a determination that hadn't been there before. "I have to. I can't move forward without knowing everything. I need to hear it from her. I need to know why she did this to us." Thomas's heart ached at the resolve in her voice. He had spent years trying to put Victoria out of his mind, avoiding the thought that she could have been involved in anything as horrific as Claire's disappearance. But now, the truth was undeniable. And while part of him wanted to shield Claire from the pain of that confrontation, he knew it wasn't his decision to make. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, "then I'll help you." Emily, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward, her expression filled with a mix of concern and resolve. "Mom, I don't want to see you hurt any more than you already have been. Are you sure this is something you're ready for?" Claire gave her daughter a small, reassuring smile. "I'm not sure of much these days," she admitted softly, "but I do know that I can't live with these questions hanging over me. If I don't do this, I'll never be able to move on." Emily nodded, though her worry was clear in her eyes. "Okay, I'm with you, whatever you decide." Thomas took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had spent his life building walls around his emotions, around his heart, and especially around his relationship with Victoria. Now, those walls were crumbling, and he wasn't sure what would be left when they finally fell. "I'll call her," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside him. "We'll get her here. But you should know, Claire, Victoria isn't going to be easy to deal with. She's manipulative. She'll try to twist things, make it seem like it wasn't her fault. You need to be prepared for that." Claire nodded, her gaze hardening. "I'll be ready." Thomas pulled out his phone, dialing the number he had long associated with tension and conflict. Victoria picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp and cold. "Thomas, what do you want now?" His grip tightened on the phone, his voice tense but controlled. "You need to come to Texas. Now." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a mocking laugh. "Texas? Why would I go there? What game are you playing, Thomas?" "No games," he replied, his voice ice cold. "Claire wants to talk to you." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with surprise and thinly veiled panic. Victoria's voice, when it finally came, was strained. "Claire? You mean—" "She remembers enough," Thomas cut her off. "And she wants answers, so you'll come. Tomorrow. Thomas, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he snapped, his patience gone. "This is happening, Victoria. I suggest you prepare yourself." Before she could argue, Thomas hung up the phone, his chest heaving with the intensity of the conversation. He looked at Claire, his heart breaking for what he knew would come next. "She'll be here tomorrow," he said softly. "But no matter what happens, you're not alone in this." Claire gave him a small, grateful nod, though the tension in her shoulders was clear. The next day was going to be difficult, maybe even more difficult than she anticipated. But this was the path she had chosen, and there was no turning back now. That night, sleep didn't come easily for any of them. Thomas lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling of his hotel room, replaying every conversation he'd ever had with Victoria in his mind. The memories of their childhood together, of their early years in business, all seemed tainted now by the knowledge of what she had done. He had always known she was ruthless, but he had never thought she would go this far. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of guilt. How had he missed this? How had he allowed Victoria to manipulate him so completely, to pull the strings of his life without him even realizing it? But it wasn't just guilt that kept him awake. It was fear. Fear for what tomorrow would bring. Fear for how Claire would handle the confrontation. Fear for how he would handle it. Across town, in the small farmhouse, Claire was also lying awake, staring out the window at the darkened fields. She had spent years building a life here, in this quiet, secluded place, never knowing that the shadows of her past were still lurking just beyond the horizon. Now, everything was coming to a head, and the woman she had once been was colliding with the woman she had become. She didn't know what to expect from Victoria. The few memories she had of Thomas's sister were vague, overshadowed by the fog that still clouded her mind. But she knew enough to understand that Victoria had wanted her gone and had succeeded in making that happen. Now, she would have to face the woman who had stolen her life from her. Morning came too quickly, the pale light of dawn creeping through the windows, signaling the start of a day that would change everything. Thomas arrived at the farmhouse early, his nerves wound tight. Emily was already up, preparing breakfast, though none of them had much of an appetite. Claire sat at the table, her face pale but calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "She'll be here soon," Thomas said quietly, sitting down across from her. Claire nodded, though she said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with unspoken fears and unasked questions. But there was nothing left to say. Now, they had to face the storm head-on. An hour later, the sound of a car pulling up the long dirt road reached their ears. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced out the window. A sleek black car rolled to a stop, and there, stepping out with her usual air of superiority, was Victoria. She looked exactly as he remembered, poised, polished, and utterly indifferent to the chaos she had caused. But Thomas could see the slight twitch in her jaw, the subtle tension in her movements. She wasn't as calm as she wanted them to believe. Thomas stood, his hands shaking as he moved toward the door. "She's here." Claire took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Let's do this." Together, they stepped outside to meet the woman who had torn their lives apart. The tension outside the farmhouse was thick, almost suffocating. The moment Victoria stepped out of her sleek black car, it was as though the very air around them had changed. She radiated cold confidence, her every movement calculated and deliberate, as if she were walking into a business meeting rather than a reckoning. Thomas stood by the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Beside him, Claire's face remained calm, but he could feel the tremor in her hands. Emily, who had followed them outside, kept a protective distance, watching her mother closely. Victoria's heels clicked against the dirt as she approached, her expression unreadable behind her designer sunglasses. She stopped a few feet away, pulling off the sunglasses slowly, her sharp gaze shifting between Thomas and Claire. "Well," Victoria said, her voice cool, detached. "Here we all are." Thomas's jaw tightened. The sight of his sister standing there, so composed after all she had done, made his blood boil. He could barely stand to look at her. But this wasn't his confrontation. It was Claire's. "You know why I asked you here," Claire said, her voice steady but low. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in her tone. Claire's strength, forged over years of survival, was emerging. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Do I? Or are we just revisiting old grievances?" Thomas stepped forward, unable to hold back any longer. "Cut the act, Victoria. You know exactly why you're here. It's time to stop lying and tell Claire the truth." Victoria's smile faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing as she turned her attention to Claire. "What truth is he talking about? Because from where I'm standing, this is all ancient history." "You took me," Claire said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You had me taken from him, from the life we were building together, and you think that just because it was 20 years ago, it doesn't matter anymore." Victoria's expression hardened, her gaze locking onto Claire's. "I didn't take you. That's a dramatic way of putting it." "Then tell me what you did," Claire demanded, stepping forward, her voice rising. "Tell me why I can't remember anything from before I moved here. Tell me why I've spent my life in the dark while you carried on with yours like nothing happened." Victoria's eyes flicked to Thomas for a split second before she spoke, her voice tight with control. "You were a complication, Claire. A distraction. Thomas was on the verge of greatness. Everything we'd worked for was finally coming together. And then you came along. You would have ruined him." "Ruined him?" Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. "We were in love. We were going to be married. You were pulling him away," Victoria shot back, her voice sharp. "Away from the business, away from his responsibilities. I wasn't about to let everything we'd built be destroyed because you two were playing house." Thomas felt the anger surge in his chest. But Claire spoke before he could. "So what did you do?" Claire demanded. "Did you have me kidnapped? Did you try to scare me off?" Victoria's lips tightened into a thin line. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said carefully, her voice cold and measured. "I just wanted you gone. I knew that if you were out of the picture, Thomas would refocus on the business, so I arranged for a separation." "A separation?" Thomas spat, stepping forward. "You had her taken. She lost her memory because of whatever you arranged. Do you have any idea what you did?" Victoria's eyes flickered with something, guilt, perhaps, or the closest thing to it. "I didn't know that would happen," she snapped. "It was never supposed to go that far." Thomas shook his head, disbelief and fury bubbling inside him. "You destroyed our lives. You took Claire from me, and you've been lying about it for 20 years. Victoria's expression hardened again, her voice turning defensive. "You think I did this for fun? For some twisted pleasure? I did it to protect you, Thomas. You've always been too soft, too easily distracted. Claire wasn't good for you." Claire's hands balled into fists at her sides, her breath coming faster as she tried to hold back the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "You had no right," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You stole my life from me. I don't even know who I was anymore. All these years, I've been living in a lie because of you." Victoria crossed her arms, her expression cold and unmoved. "It wasn't a lie. It was survival. You've survived just fine without Thomas, haven't you? You built a life for yourself." "That's not the point," Claire snapped. "The point is, you took my choices from me. You decided what was best for everyone, and now you think I should just be grateful that I've survived? I don't even know who I am anymore because of what you did." The raw pain in Claire's voice cut through the air, silencing everyone for a moment. Thomas watched as Victoria's face flickered, just for a second, with something resembling regret. But the mask of control quickly slipped back into place. "I didn't plan for it to go this way," Victoria said, her voice quieter now, but still defiant. "But it did. And here we are. I can't change the past." Claire took a deep breath, her face set with resolve. "No, you can't. But you can own up to what you did. I deserve that. Thomas deserves that." Victoria stood there, her arms crossed tightly, her jaw clenched. For a moment, it looked like she might say something, might admit to the full extent of her betrayal. But instead, she just shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin, bitter line. "Believe what you want," she said coldly. "It doesn't change anything." Thomas's fists clenched at his sides, but before he could speak, Claire stepped forward, standing directly in front of Victoria. Her eyes burned with a fierce determination, her voice steady and strong. "I'm not asking you to change anything," Claire said. "I'm telling you that I won't let you control me anymore. You may have taken 20 years from me, but I'm taking the rest back. You don't get to define who I am or what happens to me anymore." Victoria didn't flinch, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, maybe even fear. She had always been the one in control, but now Claire was standing before her, stronger than ever. "I'm done with you, Victoria," Claire said firmly. "Whatever power you think you had over me, it's gone. I'm taking my life back." With that, Claire turned on her heel and walked away, her head held high. Emily followed closely behind her, offering silent support, and together they made their way back into the farmhouse, leaving Victoria standing in stunned silence. Thomas stayed behind, his eyes locked on his sister. For a long moment, they stood there in the stillness, the weight of everything that had been said hanging in the air between them. "You'll regret this," Victoria said finally, her voice low and venomous. "No," Thomas replied quietly, his gaze steady. "You're the one who's going to regret it." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Victoria standing alone, the life she had so carefully constructed crumbling around her. Victoria stood frozen, watching as Thomas turned his back on her and walked away. For the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. She had spent decades controlling everything, her brother, his future, even Claire's life. Now, it was all unraveling before her eyes. She had expected a confrontation, but not this. Not Claire standing there with such resolve. Not Thomas walking away from her so easily, as if she no longer had any hold over him. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling, and she had no one to blame but herself. Inside the farmhouse, Claire sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea Emily had made for her. Her hands were steady now, her heart still racing from the confrontation, but there was a calmness settling over her. For the first time in years, she felt like she had control over her own life again. She had faced Victoria, and though the scars of the past remained, she no longer felt bound by them. Emily sat across from her, her eyes filled with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she said softly. "Oh, I don't know if I could have done what you just did." Claire smiled faintly, taking a sip of her tea. "You would have, Emily. You're stronger than you know." Thomas entered the room quietly, closing the door behind him. He looked tired, his shoulders heavy with the weight of everything that had happened, but there was also a sense of relief in his eyes. He walked over to the table and sat down beside Claire, his gaze searching her face. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. Claire looked down at her hands, letting out a slow breath. "Relieved?" she said finally. "And exhausted. I didn't think it would end like this." "Neither did I," Thomas admitted. but you were incredible. I don't know how you kept so calm." Claire shook her head, her smile fading. "I wasn't calm. I was furious. But I couldn't let her see that. I couldn't give her the satisfaction of knowing how much she hurt me." Thomas reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "She doesn't have that power over you anymore. You took it back." Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I still can't believe it. All these years, I thought I had just lost myself. But she took everything from me, and I didn't even know." Thomas squeezed her hand, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "We both lost so much, but we have a chance now to start over, to rebuild." Emily watched the exchange, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and sadness. She had always known her mother was strong, but seeing her stand up to Victoria, seeing the depth of the pain she had carried for so long, made her realize just how much Claire had endured in silence. "Is she going to try to come after you again?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with concern. Thomas shook his head. "No. Victoria's done. She knows she's lost this battle, and she has too much to lose to push any further." Claire leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment as the weight of the past finally began to lift. "It's strange," she said softly. "I spent so many years not knowing who I really was, not remembering the life I had before. Now that I have some of it back, I don't know what to do with it." Thomas looked at her, his voice gentle. "We'll figure it out. Together." Claire opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. There was so much between them, so much that had been lost, so much time they would never get back. But there was also a chance for something new, and that, more than anything, gave her hope. "I'm ready to try," she said quietly. "I don't know what the future looks like, but I'm ready to face it." Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in a long time. That's all that matters." Emily leaned forward, her voice soft but steady. "Whatever happens next, we'll get through it together. We're a family, right?" Claire's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of relief, of gratitude. She reached out, taking Emily's hand in one of hers and Thomas's hand in the other. "Yes," she whispered, "we're a family." For the first time in years, Claire felt the warmth of belonging, of knowing that despite everything, she wasn't alone. She had lost so much, but she had also gained something new, and that was enough. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the farmhouse. Victoria sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the weight of her own actions pressing down like a heavy cloak. She had always been the one in control, always the one calling the shots. But now, everything had slipped through her fingers. Thomas had chosen Claire. Claire had taken her life back. And for the first time in Victoria's life, she had no idea what to do next. Her phone buzzed in the seat beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Her lawyer. Of course, damage control. There was always damage control. With a sigh, she picked up the phone and answered. "Yes, I know," she said coldly. "We'll handle it." But as she spoke, something inside her shifted. She had spent her life manipulating, controlling, bending others to her will. And now that it had all fallen apart, she felt nothing. No triumph, no anger, not even regret. Just a hollow emptiness where her power had once been. For the first time, Victoria realized she had truly lost. Back inside the farmhouse, Claire stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The warmth of the evening breeze brushed against her skin, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe freely. Thomas came up beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" Claire smiled softly, turning to face him. "I'm thinking about tomorrow. For the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of it." Thomas leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Tomorrow is a new beginning. Claire nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She had taken back her life, and that was enough. Together, they watched the last rays of the sun disappear behind the horizon, ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed felt like a blur of quiet moments and cautious steps toward the future. The farmhouse, once a place filled with unanswered questions and buried memories, had become a space for healing. Claire, Thomas, and Emily spent their time together, not talking much about the past, but focusing on the present and the possibilities ahead. The weight of Victoria's betrayal still lingered, but with every passing day, it seemed to fade just a little more. There was peace now, a sense that, despite all the lost years, they had the chance to build something new, something real. Thomas stayed longer in Texas than he had originally planned. What had started as a business trip had turned into something much more personal, and the thought of leaving Claire again, after finally finding her, was unbearable. He hadn't made any promises, and neither had she, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were rebuilding, step by step, together. One morning, a few weeks after Victoria's departure, Thomas found Claire in the garden. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands gently pulling weeds from the rows of vegetables she and Emily had planted. The early morning light caught her hair, making it shine, and for a moment, Thomas just watched her. There was something so peaceful about her now, something that had been missing for so long. Claire must have sensed his presence because she looked up and smiled. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, walking over to join her. He crouched beside her, his hands resting on his knees as he watched her work. "You're always out here early. Why?" Claire shrugged, her smile soft. "It's peaceful. It helps me think." Thomas nodded, understanding. There had been so much to think about lately, so much to process. But as he sat there with her, he realized that they had already made it through the hardest part. They had faced the truth, confronted the past, and come out the other side. Now, it was just a matter of what came next. "Claire," he said quietly, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking." She glanced over at him, her eyes curious. "About what?" "About us," he replied, his heart pounding in his chest. "About what happens next." Claire's hands stilled in the dirt, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas could feel the tension in the air, but it wasn't the same kind of tension that had existed between them before. This was different, softer, filled with possibilities rather than fear. "I don't want to rush you," Thomas said carefully. "I know we've been through a lot, and I don't expect things to just go back to the way they were. But I also don't want to lose you again. Not now. Not after everything." Claire sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her jeans as she looked at him. There was something tender in her expression, something that made Thomas's heart ache with both hope and fear. "I don't want to lose you either," Claire admitted softly. "But I'm not sure what the future looks like. I'm still trying to figure out who I am now." "I know," Thomas said gently. "And I'm not asking for answers right now. I'm just asking if we can try, if we can figure it out together." Claire's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like to try." Relief washed over Thomas, and he smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "We'll take it one day at a time. Whatever you need, I'm here." Claire squeezed his hand, her smile growing a little brighter. "One day at a time sounds good." They sat in the garden for a while longer, the quiet between them comfortable now. There were no more secrets, no more lies, just the two of them and the possibilities ahead. Later that afternoon, Emily joined them in the kitchen as they prepared lunch. The three of them moved around the small space easily, falling into a rhythm that felt natural, as though they had been doing this for years. It was simple, but there was a comfort in the simplicity. For the first time, they all felt like a family, connected not by blood, but by the shared experience of surviving something so painful it could have broken them. As they sat down to eat, Thomas looked around the table, feeling something inside him shift. He had spent so many years chasing after success, trying to fill the void that Claire had left behind. But now, sitting here with her and Emily, he realized that what he had been searching for all along wasn't success. It was this: a family, a sense of belonging, of love. It wouldn't be perfect, and it wouldn't be easy. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many scars that would take time to heal. But they had survived. They had found their way back to each other. And that, more than anything, gave him hope. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Thomas and Claire took a walk through the fields. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink, and the air was warm, filled with the scent of wildflowers. They walked in silence for a while, the rhythm of their footsteps in sync, the world around them quiet and peaceful. At some point, Claire stopped, turning to face him. Her eyes were soft, filled with a quiet resolve. "Thomas," she said softly, "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you." Thomas's heart swelled with emotion, and he reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We'll figure it out together," he promised. They stood there for a moment, wrapped in the quiet of the evening, before Claire leaned in, resting her head against his chest. Thomas wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, the warmth of her presence filling the empty spaces inside him that had been there for so long. The past had taken so much from them, but now they had a future. And whatever that future held, they would face it together.